It was a stormy night when David Carter, a security guard at an abandoned factory in Chicago, began his usual shift. The rain poured down relentlessly, and the night was eerily quiet. Suddenly, a mysterious woman appeared outside the gate, soaked, silent, and with a gaze that sent chills down his spine. Little did David know, this seemingly ordinary night was about to turn into a nightmare he could never have imagined. David Carter had worked the graveyard shift at the old, abandoned factory for the past 5 years. A man of routine, he knew exactly how the hours would unfold. The eerie hum of the factory's old machinery, the occasional creak of the building settling, and the silence that seemed to envelop everything once the night truly took hold. The rain was relentless tonight, beating against the windows like 100 tiny hammers. But the storm, though fierce, wasn't what caught David's attention. No, it was the woman. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He had been scanning the cameras when his gaze landed on the factory gate. Through the storm's heavy downpour, he saw her, a figure standing just outside the entrance. Soaked to the bone, she didn't move, just stood there staring. Her hair clung to her face, and her clothes were drenched, as if she had been standing in the rain for hours. David squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Who would be out there, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour? Curiosity and unease both gripped him as he adjusted the camera angle. The woman's gaze was unblinking, locked onto the factory like she was waiting for something. Who the hell is that? David muttered under his breath, sitting up straighter in his chair. He was used to the occasional stray animal or drifter passing by, but this felt different. Something about her stillness, her silence, unsettled him. He grabbed his flashlight and made his way to the front door, the echo of his boots against the concrete floor the only sound in the heavy, damp silence of the building. As he stepped outside, the cold air hit him like a slap to the face. The rain was coming down harder now, and the wind howled around the corners of the building, tugging at his jacket. There, just beyond the gate, was the woman. She didn't move an inch. "Hey," David called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" No response. His heartbeat quickened. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. It was as though she couldn't hear him, or worse, didn't want to hear him. She just stood there, staring at the factory. "Ma'am, are you all right?" David took a step closer, trying to bridge the distance between them. He felt uneasy, like a heavy weight was pressing down on his chest. There was something wrong, something inexplicably off about this whole situation. Still, no response. David stopped a few feet from the gate, the woman's stillness unnerving him. His flashlight flickered in his hand, casting strange shadows across the scene. It was as if the very air had thickened around them, the storm's noise drowning out every other sound. Suddenly, she turned her head. The movement was so abrupt, so sharp, that David took a step back in alarm. Her eyes met his, locking with his gaze, and David felt a chill run down his spine. Her eyes were dark, hollow, empty. It was like she was staring straight into his soul, peeling back layers of his mind he never thought would be exposed. "Help me," she whispered, her voice so soft that David almost didn't hear it over the roar of the storm. "Please help me." The words were a strange combination of pleading and command, a voice that echoed in his mind even after she stopped speaking. David stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get away from this strange woman standing in the pouring rain, but something kept him rooted to the spot. "Help me," she repeated, her voice softer this time but still chilling. "You're the only one who can." David swallowed hard, stepping back. He wasn't sure whether it was the cold, the storm, or something else that had him on edge, but he couldn't ignore the sense of urgency in her voice. All right, just stay there. I'll get you some help," David said, his voice more uncertain than he would have liked. But as he turned to head back into the factory to call for assistance, something stopped him. A sudden, bone-chilling wind howled through the gate, slamming it shut with a deafening clang. The sound echoed in David's ears, and he spun around, heart racing in his chest. The woman was gone. There was no sign of her, no trace, no footprints in the wet ground. She had simply vanished, as if she had never been there at all. David stood there for a long moment, the rain pelting down on him, his mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had he imagined it? Was it just the storm playing tricks on him? But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Something dark, something sinister, was waiting for him tonight. David stood frozen for a few moments, staring at the empty spot where the woman had stood. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees nearby, but there was an eerie silence that had settled over the factory grounds. The only sound was the relentless rain, hitting the concrete and the rusted metal of the factory like tiny bullets. He blinked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had been there, right? He hadn't imagined her. He couldn't have. The storm had been too harsh, too real. And yet, when he turned back, she was gone, leaving only the echo of her haunting plea in the air. "Stay calm, Dave," he muttered to himself. "You're just tired. The storm's messing with your head." But no matter how much he tried to convince himself, something deep within him knew the truth. This wasn't a trick of the mind. He walked back to the gate, his steps tentative as he approached the spot where the woman had disappeared. His flashlight swept over the wet ground, illuminating the muddy puddles, the scattered debris, but there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the storm. Maybe she's hiding somewhere, David reasoned, trying to keep his nerves in check. But even as he thought this, he knew it was unlikely. A person couldn't just disappear in the middle of a storm like that, not without a trace. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the factory, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. David spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. He had heard that noise clearly, as though someone had thrown something against the window in the security room. His instincts screamed at him to go back inside, but his curiosity, and perhaps a growing sense of dread, pulled him forward. "All right, I'm going in," David muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He turned back toward the building, his steps quickening as the wind picked up, blowing the rain sideways. When he reached the door, it was slightly ajar, as if it had been pushed open just enough to let the storm in. He stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of damp concrete and metal. The factory was dark, with only the flickering light from the security cameras providing any illumination. His footsteps echoed through the empty halls as he made his way to the security room. The shattered glass lay on the floor, a jagged hole in the window where someone had thrown it. David frowned as he examined the broken window. No signs of forced entry. No footprints leading away from the window. Nothing except for the rain that was now seeping in through the shattered glass. He reached for the intercom, ready to call for backup or report the incident. But as his hand brushed the button, the lights flickered and then went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness. David froze. "Not now," he whispered, his voice shaky. "This isn't happening." The only sound now was the storm outside, the wind howling louder than ever. He reached for the flashlight in his pocket, turning it on and casting a beam of light around the room. It was eerily quiet, except for the distant sound of something scraping across the floor. David's heart raced. He tried to steady his breathing. "It's just the wind," he muttered, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The scraping sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the building, and it was moving closer. A shadow flickered in the corner of his eye, and he whirled around, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. His pulse thudded in his ears, his fingers tightening around the flashlight. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the unnerving silence. Then a soft whisper echoed through the room. "David." The voice was faint, like a breath carried on the wind. But it was unmistakable. It was the woman's voice, the same voice that had whispered those chilling words outside. "Help me." David's body went cold. His legs felt like they were made of stone. The air around him seemed to grow colder, thicker, as if the room itself was becoming something else. Something dark, something alive. He turned quickly, his eyes scanning every corner of the room. But there was nothing except the quiet hum of the remaining security monitors, showing empty factory halls. Then he heard it again. "David." This time, the voice was closer. Too close. He spun around, heart pounding. His flashlight beam landed on something, or rather, someone. Standing in the doorway of the security room was the woman. Her eyes were wide open, black as coal, and her soaked hair hung in tangled strands around her face. Her lips were twisted in a strange, almost unnatural smile. What do you want?" David stammered, his voice trembling. But the woman didn't speak. Instead, she stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were gliding across the floor. The temperature in the room dropped, and David's breath became visible in the air. He backed away, his feet stumbling over the broken glass on the floor, but the woman didn't stop. With each step she took, the darkness seemed to grow, filling the room, pushing him back into the shadows. David's heart was hammering in his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones. the air thick with an oppressive weight that made every movement feel sluggish. His eyes stayed locked on the woman as she glided closer, her wet clothes dripping in a steady stream, pooling at her feet. For a moment, David's mind went blank. His instincts screamed for him to run, to get out of there, but his body felt paralyzed, as if frozen in place by the weight of her gaze. What do you want from me?" he asked again, his voice barely a whisper, trembling as it escaped his throat. His feet shuffled back instinctively, but the woman's eyes followed every movement. Her lips parted slowly, her smile stretching unnaturally wide, far beyond what should have been possible. The way her mouth opened, it was as though her jaw was unhinging, and the sight made David's stomach churn with a primal fear. "You can't escape," she whispered, her voice low and soft, yet it seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the factory. "Not from me. Not from this place." David's mind raced, trying to make sense of her words. He had to get out. There had to be some way to escape. But no matter how hard he tried to force his legs to move, they wouldn't obey. Then, the woman took another step, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. David could see his breath now, rising in front of him like steam. His fingers gripped the flashlight tighter, but the beam flickered, casting long shadows across the walls, distorting reality. Her eyes never left his. "You're the one who has been chosen," she said, her voice growing colder, more distorted, like 1,000 whispers buried deep in his mind. "You can't run. You're already part of it." Part of what? David thought, his heart pounding in his chest. Before he could react, the lights above him buzzed and flickered once more, illuminating the woman's face for just a moment in an unnatural dim glow. Her skin was pale, paler than anyone's should be, and her eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to drain the life from everything they touched. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from behind him. Something heavy, something sharp falling from the ceiling. David's flashlight swung wildly toward the sound, revealing nothing but shadows and dust. When he turned back to face the woman, she was closer than ever. Her mouth was open now, wider than before, and she let out a low, guttural growl that made David's spine stiffen with terror. "Help me," the woman whispered again, though this time the words were twisted, suffused with a dark, mocking tone. "You're the one who will help me." David's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. He wasn't helping her. He was trapped. He was the one being hunted. Before he could react, the air around him seemed to distort. The walls of the factory groaned and shifted, and he could swear he saw shapes moving in the corners of his vision. Shapes that weren't human, shapes that didn't belong. His head spun, the room blurring as if it were warping around him. A sudden, sharp pain shot through his skull, and David staggered backward, crashing into the desk behind him. His breath came in short gasps, and his mind was filled with strange images, flashes of the factory's past, memories of a time when it wasn't abandoned, when it was alive with activity. But the faces of the people who had worked here were blurry, their features hidden in shadows, as if they were nothing more than fleeting figures in a nightmare. Through the fog in his mind, one image stood out: a group of workers gathered around the factory's old furnace. There was a ritual happening, something dark, something that shouldn't have been done. And then a voice, familiar yet distant, echoed in his ears. "Help me." David shook his head, trying to clear the images, but they only grew stronger, more vivid. He could hear whispers now, hundreds of voices, all calling to him, begging him to do something, to remember. "Get out of my head," he screamed, but the voices only grew louder. Suddenly, the woman lunged at him, her hands outstretched like claws. David's instincts kicked in, and he twisted away, narrowly avoiding her grasp. He pushed himself to his feet, his mind still spinning from the images and the whispers. He had to leave. He had to get out. He sprinted toward the exit, his heart racing, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty halls. The woman's voice followed him, growing louder with each step. "David, you can't leave." He reached the front doors, the storm outside battering against the factory's walls. The rain was coming down in sheets, but at least he would be out of that cursed building, away from her, away from whatever nightmare he had just experienced. But as his hand touched the door handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. His breath quickened, panic clawing at his chest. "No, no, no, and no," he shouted, pulling at the handle with all his strength. The temperature dropped again, and David could feel something behind him. Slowly, he turned, the flashlight shaking in his hand. There, in the doorway of the security room, was the woman again. She wasn't moving, but her eyes locked onto his, her smile widening impossibly. "Leaving so soon?" she asked softly. You haven't even begun to understand. David's chest tightened with terror as the air around him grew heavier, darker, and colder. He was trapped, and the nightmare had only just begun. David stood frozen, his back pressed against the cold metal door, heart pounding in his chest. Every instinct told him to run, to escape, but the door refused to open, and the woman, whatever she was, stood between him and freedom. Her smile stretched unnaturally wide, her hollow eyes glinting with a terrible knowing. Why are you doing this? David's voice cracked, his throat dry. He was desperate for answers, but every word that left his mouth only seemed to fuel the darkness that surrounded him. The woman stepped forward, her feet making no sound on the cracked concrete floor, as if she was gliding through the air. She was so close now, too close. He could smell the dampness of her clothes, the stale scent of decay that seemed to follow her wherever she went. You've already helped, she said, her voice a soft whisper, but it carried the weight of centuries of secrets. You don't remember, but you've been a part of this for much longer than you realize. David's head was spinning. He didn't understand what she meant. What was she talking about? He had only been assigned to the factory a few weeks ago. His mind raced, trying to piece together anything that could explain what was happening. But all he could focus on was her. This woman, this ghostly presence that seemed to draw him deeper into her web with each passing moment. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of intense sorrow. You were here before, in another life, another time. The words hit David like a physical blow. Another life? What did she mean? You worked here, she continued, her eyes growing darker, her voice a whisper of something ancient. You were part of the ritual. You, just like the others, thought you could escape, but you can never leave. Not once you've been chosen. David's breath quickened. A ritual? He couldn't remember any such thing. He'd never been part of anything like that, at least not in this life. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses. He was a practical man, a skeptic. But now, standing in this darkened factory with the woman so close, her presence so overwhelming, he was beginning to question everything he thought he knew. The woman took another step forward, and David instinctively stepped back, his eyes flicking to the exit. His mind screamed for him to find another way out, but every exit seemed blocked. Every shadow felt like it was closing in on him. Who are you? He asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to stay calm. What do you want from me? Her eyes softened slightly, as if she were pitying him, and for a moment, she almost seemed human again. But then the darkness crept back into her gaze, and the cold air around them grew even more suffocating. You're not the first, she said, her voice low and filled with an eerie finality. And you won't be the last. You will remember, just like all the others before you. But it's already too late. There's no escaping what's already begun. David's mind reeled, struggling to make sense of her words. He was already beginning to remember bits and pieces, flashes of images, broken fragments of a life that didn't feel like his own. It was as though the factory, the place he had come to see as nothing more than an abandoned shell, had been alive with dark energy long before he arrived. You don't understand, he whispered, his mind grasping at the fleeting memories. I never agreed to any of this. I never wanted this. The woman's eyes flashed with something dangerous, something ancient. You don't need to agree, she said coldly. You're part of it now. You always have been. The words echoed in David's mind, vibrating through his skull as if they were being carved into his very soul. He could feel it now, the pull, the darkness. There was no way out, no escape. And just as David was about to speak again, the lights above him flickered and went out entirely, plunging the factory into complete darkness. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing against him from all sides. His breath hitched, the only sound now the thudding of his own heart in his chest. Then, just as suddenly as the darkness had descended, a light flickered on in the distance. It was dim, barely a pinprick in the vast expanse of shadow, but it was enough for David to see a figure standing in the doorway, a man, a worker from the past. His clothes were old-fashioned, his face pale and gaunt, but his eyes, they were the same dark, empty pits that the woman had. The same eyes that had been haunting David ever since he set foot in this cursed place. The man's mouth opened, and for a moment, David could hear the faintest whispers, a language he didn't understand, words that felt foreign, ancient. The man stepped forward, and as he did, a surge of memories slammed into David's mind with such force that it almost knocked him to the ground. He saw the factory in its prime, bustling with workers, the smell of burning metal filling the air. But something was wrong. There was a darkness there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to consume everyone. The workers had been caught in it, drawn into it, just like David. The ritual, the one the woman had spoken of. David had been part of it once, long ago. He hadn't chosen it. He hadn't even realized it. But now that it was awakening, now that it was pulling him back into its grasp, he understood the horrifying truth. He was never meant to escape. No one was. The factory, the people, the woman, they were all part of something much darker than David could ever have imagined. And now, as he stood there in the cold, trapped between the dead past and the terrifying present, David realized that he was about to play a role in a nightmare that had no end. David's heart raced as the factory's air seemed to tighten around him, the oppressive darkness pressing against him from every side. The figure of the man, standing motionless in the doorway, stared at him with eyes that burned with an unnatural intensity. The faint whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was as if the very walls of the factory were alive, speaking a language older than time itself. He tried to move, to run, but his legs refused to obey. The terror that gripped him was like a heavy weight pressing down on him, and his breath came in shallow gasps. The woman, who had been so close just moments ago, was now gone, vanished into the shadows. But the sense of her presence lingered, wrapping around him like a cold shroud. The man in the doorway took a step forward, and with it, a sudden wave of memories crashed into David's mind. The images were disjointed, fragmented, like a broken mirror reflecting pieces of a past he didn't fully understand. He saw the factory as it had been, alive with workers, the hum of machinery, the chatter of voices. But there was a darker undercurrent to it all, a sense of unease that never seemed to leave, a feeling that something was terribly wrong. He remembered the ritual, the whispered words, the cold touch of hands he couldn't see, the blood that had stained the factory's floors long before his arrival. David recoiled from the memories, but they were relentless, forcing him to relive the events that had bound him to this place. "You can't escape," the man in the doorway whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of whispers. "Not now. Not anymore." David's pulse thundered in his ears as the factory seemed to warp around him, the walls stretching and bending in unnatural ways. The faint light from the doorway flickered again, casting long, twisting shadows across the floor. And with each passing second, the shadows grew longer, darker, as if the very building itself were trying to swallow him whole. The woman's voice, soft but chilling, echoed in his mind. "You will remember soon enough. It's already begun." David's mind was spinning. He had to find a way out. He had to escape. But the factory, with its endless maze of corridors and rooms, felt like it was closing in on him, trapping him in a nightmare that had no end. He could feel the walls pressing against him, the air thick with a malevolent energy. Desperation surged within him. He turned toward the nearest exit, only to see the door slowly creaking shut. The sound of the hinges groaning filled the silence, as though the building itself was closing in on him, locking him in with whatever horrors lurked in the dark. "Stop," David whispered to himself, his voice shaking. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to be part of it." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. It was too late for him. He had been drawn into this place, into this curse, and there was no turning back. His only hope now was to survive, to find some way to escape the factory's clutches before it consumed him entirely. As if sensing his thoughts, the man in the doorway stepped aside, revealing the full extent of what lay beyond. The hallway stretched out before him, dark and foreboding, but there was something else there, something that shouldn't have been. The walls seemed to shift and distort, their surfaces writhing as though alive. The shadows moved in strange, unnatural ways, flickering with the faint glow of something monstrous lurking just out of sight. The whispers grew louder, now almost deafening, as if the very building itself were speaking to him. A low, guttural hum filled the air, vibrating in his bones. David's pulse quickened as he realized the horrible truth. The factory wasn't just haunted. It was alive. Alive with something ancient, something powerful, something that had been waiting for him, for all of them, to return. "You are the key," the man whispered, his voice colder now, filled with an unsettling calm. "And once you enter, there's no turning back." David took a step back, his mind racing. The man's words haunted him, but there was no time to dwell on them. He had to move, had to escape. The factory was alive, and it wanted him. It wanted all of them. The figure of the man in the doorway seemed to shimmer, his form flickering like a shadow, and then he was gone. Vanished. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent. until they filled every corner of his mind. The factory was calling him, pulling him deeper into its web of darkness. David stumbled forward, his heart hammering in his chest, his feet unsteady on the uneven floor. The hallway stretched out before him, dark and endless, like a tunnel leading to nowhere. The whispers were everywhere now, wrapping around him like tendrils, their voices a constant presence in his ears. And then, from the darkness ahead, came the faintest flicker of light. It was enough to draw him forward. But as he took another step, something caught his foot. David looked down, his eyes widening as he saw what had ensnared him: chains. Rusted, old chains, twisted around his ankle, pulling him back toward the darkness. His heart raced as he struggled to free himself, but it was no use. The chains tightened with every movement, dragging him back toward the shadows. He could hear her now, the woman's voice, softer than before but filled with an unmistakable hunger. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. You will never be free." The darkness closed in around him, suffocating him, as the factory's grip tightened with an iron will. David struggled, his pulse racing as the chains wrapped tighter around his ankle. The whispers grew louder, louder than his own breath, louder than the sound of his racing heart. The weight of the factory's presence pressed down on him like an unseen hand, suffocating, pulling him deeper into its grip. He jerked his leg, desperate to break free, but the chains only tightened. His fingers scraped against the cold, rusted metal, feeling its sharp edges dig into his skin. The sound of the links scraping against each other echoed in the empty corridor, a sound that filled him with dread. "No, not again," David muttered, his voice weak as his panic intensified. He had been here before, trapped, surrounded by the suffocating darkness, unable to escape. But he couldn't remember how. He couldn't remember anything beyond the last few moments. His mind was a blur, a tangle of memories and fear that refused to untangle. As he tugged harder, the chains seemed to come alive, slithering like serpents around his legs, pulling him toward the deep, unending shadows of the hallway. His breath quickened. The woman's voice, soft and cold, echoed through the corridor. "You should have stayed outside. You should have listened," she whispered, a cruel edge to her words. The light in the distance flickered again, just out of reach, almost like a beacon in the dark. It was as though someone was trying to guide him, to lure him toward it. But David knew better than to trust anything in this factory. Every step he took seemed to push him further into the unknown. With every ounce of strength left in him, he yanked at the chains again, his body straining, his muscles burning with the effort. He was close, so close, but it wasn't enough. The chains dragged him down, deeper into the darkness. The woman's voice grew louder, the tone now layered with malice. "You think you can escape? You think you can run from what you've already become?" David's mind reeled. What had she said? What did she mean? Become what? His vision blurred as the dark shapes around him seemed to shift and swirl. The factory walls twisted in unnatural ways, bending and stretching like they were made of rubber. The oppressive air was thick with the sense that something was watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. With a final desperate jerk, David broke free from the chains. But as he stumbled forward, trying to get to his feet, a force knocked him back down. He hit the cold floor hard, his body slamming against the concrete with a sickening thud. A figure emerged from the darkness, silhouetted by the faint light ahead. The figure was tall, almost impossibly tall, and its outline seemed to ripple like water. It stepped forward, and with each step, the light from the distance seemed to flicker and die. David's breath hitched. The figure's face was obscured, but its presence was overwhelming. He felt its eyes on him, even though he couldn't see them. The voice came again, low and calm, but filled with an unnerving sense of finality. "You should have never stepped foot inside." David's instincts screamed at him to run, to get out of there, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs were frozen, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. He had nowhere to go, no way to escape. The figure continued to approach, its steps slow, deliberate. "Who are you?" David finally managed to rasp, his throat dry, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out with one elongated arm, the fingers stretching unnaturally long, like something out of a nightmare. David recoiled in fear, but he couldn't move. The fingers brushed against his face, sending an icy chill through his skin. His vision blurred again, and suddenly, the factory's walls seemed to distort even further, shifting like liquid. The whispers began to intensify once more, as if the entire building had come alive, all of it speaking at once. And then, through the chaos, he heard her voice again, the woman who had been watching him from the gate, the one who had haunted him in his every step. "You're not the first," she said, her voice now echoing through every corner of the factory. "You won't be the last." David's pulse raced. His thoughts were scattered, and the fear seemed to overtake him, drowning out everything else. The figure in front of him continued to loom, its eyes now glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. And then, for the first time since he had entered this cursed place, David understood. This was no ordinary factory. This was a place of torment, a place where souls were trapped, bound by the same dark force that had now claimed him. He had been marked the moment he stepped inside, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape. "Please," David gasped, his voice breaking. "I don't want this." The figure didn't respond, but its grip tightened on his face, the cold fingers sinking into his skin. The air around him seemed to freeze, and time itself appeared to slow down. The walls of the factory, once alive with whispers, now seemed to grow still. Everything was silent, everything except the heartbeat in his ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the figure released him. The cold fingers pulled away, and the darkness around him receded slightly. David's breathing was erratic as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The light in the distance flickered once more, drawing him forward. Without thinking, he stood up and began to move toward it. He didn't know if he was making the right choice, but something inside told him he had no other option. The factory, with its cursed walls and haunted shadows, seemed to hold its breath as David took each step toward the light. Whatever awaited him in that light, he had no idea. But one thing was clear: this was just the beginning. David's steps echoed in the silence as he moved toward the flickering light. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the very walls of the factory were closing in around him. Each step brought him closer to the light, yet it seemed to get farther away, taunting him with its unreachable promise of salvation. He stumbled, his legs shaky, the feeling of being watched intensifying with every breath he took. The whispers, which had once been distant, now seemed to come from all around him, too numerous to count, speaking in unison. They were nonsensical, maddening fragments of sentences, fragments of memories. They echoed of things David could not remember, words he could not comprehend. "She's watching. It's too late." The words seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, seeping into his mind, making it difficult to separate reality from madness. He wanted to scream, to make it stop, but no sound came out. His throat was tight, constricted by the weight of what was happening. As he neared the light, it flickered again, more violently this time, casting eerie shadows on the factory walls. For a brief moment, David could have sworn he saw something moving within the light. Something humanoid, but twisted, its features warped and unsettling. He froze in place, his heartbeat quickening. Was it the same figure that had haunted him before? Or something else entirely? With a burst of energy, he pushed forward, not stopping to think. The light beckoned him, offering an escape from the suffocating darkness that seemed to close in from all sides. He could no longer tell if he was running towards safety or deeper into the nightmare. When David finally reached the source of the light, he found himself standing before an old, rusted door. The light was coming from the crack beneath it, spilling out like liquid fire. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. What lay beyond that door? Would it be the salvation he had been desperately searching for, or something far worse? Without thinking, he grabbed the handle and twisted. The door creaked open slowly, almost painfully, as if the building itself were resisting his entry. When the door finally gave way, David found himself stepping into a small, dimly lit room. It was unlike anything he had seen before in the factory. Clean, almost pristine, with white walls and a soft glow that filled the space with an unnatural calm. At the far end of the room, sitting in the center of a chair, was a woman. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with dark hair cascading around her shoulders. Her skin was pale, almost ethereal, and her eyes, black as coal, were locked on David with an intensity that made his blood run cold. "You're here," she whispered, her voice soft yet commanding. "I've been waiting for you." David's mind raced. Who was this woman? Why did she look so familiar? As if he had seen her before but couldn't place where or when. The moment their eyes locked, he felt a chill spread through him, a deep sense of dread that crawled under his skin like an unseen presence. Who are you?" David asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain calm. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she slowly stood from the chair, her movements graceful, yet somehow unsettling. She took a step toward him, and with each movement, the room seemed to grow colder. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing in on him from all sides. "You should know who I am," she said cryptically. "You've seen me. You've felt me. Every corner of this place is a part of me." David's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the weight of her words settle in his chest. Had he? He thought back to the many nights he had spent wandering the factory, the strange occurrences, the whispers in the darkness. He could almost picture her face now, hidden behind the shadows, watching him, waiting for him. "You're the one," David started, his voice barely a whisper. "The woman from outside the gate you." "Yes," she interrupted, her voice almost a hiss. "I'm the one who called you here. And I'm the one who will keep you here." The room seemed to shift around him, the walls closing in as though the factory itself was shifting with her words. His pulse quickened as the realization hit him. He wasn't standing in a room anymore. He was inside the very heart of the nightmare. The factory wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and she was its beating heart. "You've come too far to turn back now," the woman continued, her voice now filled with an unsettling calmness. "This place, it feeds on the souls of those who enter. And you, David, are no exception. You've already given a piece of yourself. All that's left is to claim it." David's breath hitched as he looked around, his mind reeling. The factory had been waiting for him. It had been drawing him in all along, and now, there was no escaping its grasp. He wasn't just trapped in a building. He was trapped in a cycle, an endless loop of torment that would keep him locked in this nightmare forever. "Why me?" he managed to croak. "Why are you doing this?" The woman smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Because you were always meant to be here. You were chosen, and you'll never leave." David felt a coldness spread through his chest as he tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed, trapped in the woman's gaze, unable to break free. The room began to distort again, the walls flickering like a dying light, and for the first time, David understood. He wasn't going to escape. Not now. Not ever. David's heart pounded in his chest as the woman's smile stretched wider, her eyes darkening, the shadows in the room deepening. The walls of the factory seemed to pulse with a life of their own, each beat vibrating through the air like a quiet warning. He tried to move again, but his body was still frozen, as if the very air in the room was holding him in place. His mind raced, desperate for an escape, but all he could think about were her words. "You were chosen." Suddenly, the woman took a step closer, her figure now looming over him, casting a long shadow that seemed to crawl toward him. Her presence felt suffocating, the temperature in the room dropping further, the chill creeping under his skin. "You've always been part of this place," she whispered, her voice now a low, almost soothing hum. "The factory remembers. It remembers everyone who enters. And it remembers you." David's breath caught in his throat as the room seemed to twist. He saw flashes of images, blurred and disjointed. His own reflection, distorted and fading, his face gaunt and pale. He saw glimpses of his past, lost moments, faces he'd forgotten, memories that didn't belong to him. Each vision felt like a piece of the puzzle clicking into place, but it only brought more confusion. "Stop!" David shouted, his voice breaking through the fog. But no sound left his lips, only an echo that seemed to come from another time, another place. The woman took another step, her expression unreadable. "You're too far gone now. You're already part of it. The factory will never let you leave." David's mind spun. He had been the security guard, just a man doing his job. He hadn't known what he was walking into that stormy night. He hadn't known that this abandoned factory held the key to a dark history, a cursed legacy that stretched back decades. But now, standing in the heart of it, he realized there was no escaping it. Not anymore. Suddenly, the room around him began to shift again, the walls undulating like waves in the ocean. The door he had entered through vanished, replaced by another and another, all shifting in and out of existence like they were never truly there. David's head throbbed with pain, his body aching as if it were being pulled in every direction at once. "Where am I?" he asked, the words coming out weak and strangled. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped to the side, her hand moving to gesture at the shifting walls around them. "This place doesn't exist in the same way you do. It's a liminal space, a place between the living and the dead, between the known and the forgotten. It's a reflection of all who have come before you. And now, David, it's a reflection of you." David stared at her, confused and horrified. "What do you mean?" She gave a small, eerie chuckle, her dark eyes never leaving his. "You're a part of the cycle. Everyone who enters this factory becomes a part of its story. Their fears, their regrets, their pain. All of it is absorbed into the factory, and it lives on in the echoes of the past. And you, David, are no exception. David's head began to spin, and the world around him seemed to blur. He couldn't tell what was real anymore. The walls, the floor, the woman, everything felt like it was slipping away, distorting into something unrecognizable. Was he still in the factory? Or had he already crossed into something darker, something deeper? No, he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. I'm not one of them. I'm not like you. But the woman's face was already inches from his, her expression cold and distant. You're wrong. You've been here longer than you think. And then, without warning, the air itself seemed to crackle. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the walls began to close in on him. His vision blurred, and a sense of overwhelming dread washed over him like a tidal wave. The woman's figure began to distort, her features stretching and warping into something monstrous. David tried to scream, but no sound left him. He tried to move, but his body remained frozen. The factory was no longer just a building. It was alive, a living, breathing entity that consumed everything in its path. It had been waiting for him, watching him. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deep within the factory. It sounded like something, or someone was breaking free, desperate to escape. The walls around David pulsed with the sound, and he could feel the heartbeat of the factory thrumming beneath his feet, vibrating through his bones. Help me, he screamed in his mind, desperate, pleading. But the words were swallowed by the growing noise. The woman was now gone. In her place stood a figure, a shadow, a silhouette, like something drawn from the darkest corners of his mind. David's pulse raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening, but everything around him felt like it was slipping through his fingers, the world collapsing into chaos. Then, as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The noise, the shifting walls, the presence of the woman, all of it vanished in an instant. David was left standing alone in the silence, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he forced himself to stay upright. The factory was still here, but he knew it was waiting for him. For what? David didn't know. But one thing was certain. The nightmare had only just begun. David stood frozen, the factory around him eerily silent. The air felt thick, as if it were suffocating him. His heart was pounding in his chest, every beat echoing in his ears. The fear had settled in, curling around him like a vice, tightening with every breath he took. He tried to steady himself, to make sense of everything that had happened, but the more he thought, the more his mind seemed to unravel. The shadowy figure, the one that had replaced the woman, was gone. But something remained. The sensation of eyes watching him, the weight of an unseen presence, made his skin crawl. He wasn't alone. He could feel it, deep in his bones. A low whisper, like a soft breeze through the trees, brushed against his ear. David spun around, his eyes scanning the empty factory. But there was nothing, just shadows and the faint hum of something alive. Was it in his mind? Was it the factory playing tricks on him? He couldn't tell anymore. His sanity was hanging by a thread, slipping through his fingers with every passing second. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a loud clang, metal on metal. David flinched, his heart racing again as the sound echoed throughout the empty hallways. It came from deep within the factory, somewhere in the darkness that stretched out before him. Without thinking, David moved toward the sound. His feet felt heavy, as if the floor beneath him was pulling him down. The factory seemed to stretch on forever, the dark corridors twisting and turning like a maze. The farther he went, the more the air grew cold, the more his breath came out in visible clouds. The clang sounded again, followed by another, and then another. It was as if someone or something was trying to break free. The noise grew louder, more frantic, each strike against the metal more desperate than the last. David reached the source of the noise, a large metal door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, the jagged edges of the metal groaning as if under great pressure. Something, or someone was trapped inside. A sense of dread gripped David's chest as he slowly approached the door. The sound of scraping metal filled the air, each screech sending chills down his spine. He reached out with a shaking hand and pulled at the door, its rusted hinges creaking in protest. The door swung open with a painful groan, revealing a dark room beyond. The light from his flashlight barely penetrated the thick shadows that filled the space. But there, in the corner, he saw it, a figure, hunched and twisted, its back to him. David's breath caught in his throat. The figure was humanoid but grotesque. Its limbs were long and spindly, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. It was rocking back and forth, its hands clutching at its head, muttering to itself in a low, guttural voice. No, no more, no more. David took a step forward, his mind screaming at him to run, to get out of there before it was too late. But his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The figure suddenly stopped rocking and turned toward him. Its face was obscured by tangled, dark hair, but David could feel its gaze upon him. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, as if the very room was frozen by the thing's presence. Then it spoke. You shouldn't have come, it rasped, its voice a low, gravelly whisper. None of you should have come. David's heart skipped a beat. The voice, it wasn't human. It sounded like it came from the depths of the earth, like something ancient and malevolent. What are you? David whispered, barely able to make the words come out. The figure tilted its head, its long hair falling away to reveal a face twisted in agony, eyes wide and bloodshot. It smiled, a grin that stretched far too wide, far too unnaturally. The smile was hollow, like the grin of something that had long since lost its humanity. I am what the factory has made me, it said, its voice distorted, as if several voices were speaking at once. And now, I am what you will become. David recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. The thing stepped toward him, its movement jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by unseen strings. It reached out with one long, bony finger, pointing directly at David. No, David said, his voice trembling. I'm not like you. The figure's smile widened. You are, it whispered. You're already part of it, just like the others. The factory seemed to groan in response, its walls shifting, the metal echoing with the sounds of distant screams, the air thick with the stench of decay. The shadows seemed to close in around David, swallowing him whole. The thing lunged at him. David barely had time to react. The creature lunged, its long, twisted limbs closing the gap between them faster than he could blink. His instincts kicked in, and he stumbled backward, throwing himself to the side just as the thing's claw-like fingers raked through the air where he had stood a moment ago. The force of the creature's movement sent a cold wind sweeping through the room, a chill that cut through David's bones like ice. He scrambled to his feet, heart pounding, legs trembling with fear. The creature's eyes were locked on him, filled with hunger and something darker. Something ancient, something that had lived within the factory for as long as it had existed. David backed away, his flashlight shaking in his hand, casting erratic beams of light against the walls. The figure seemed to be everywhere at once, its movement unnatural, gliding through the air in a way that no human body could. It circled him, a predator toying with its prey. You can't escape, the creature whispered, its voice crawling into David's mind like a cold, gnawing presence. None of you can. The factory never lets you leave. David's pulse thundered in his ears. His thoughts were a blur, and all he could hear was the echo of the creature's voice. The walls of the factory seemed to close in, the distance between him and the exit growing further with each passing moment. He felt trapped, suffocated by the factory's insidious pull. Why? David gasped, his voice shaking as he tried to make sense of everything. Why me? Why now? The creature's eyes glinted, the smile on its face widening until it seemed to stretch impossibly wide. It's not about you, it said, the multiple voices in its words twisting together. It's about what you've become. The factory chose you. You're one of us now. David shook his head violently, denying the truth. He couldn't be. He hadn't done anything. He was just a security guard, just doing his job. He hadn't asked for any of this. But deep down, a terrifying thought settled in his mind. The factory had been watching him long before tonight. It had been drawing him in, like a fly to a spider's web, and now he was stuck in its grasp. He had no way out. The factory's heartbeat echoed louder, thumping in time with his own, growing faster and more frantic, until it seemed like the entire building was trembling. The shadows grew deeper, crawling along the walls like living things, suffocating the space around him. The creature's mouth opened wider, revealing rows of jagged, rotting teeth. It let out a sound that was part scream, part laughter, an unnerving combination of terror and madness. You're already here, David, it said. There's no escaping what you've become. David turned and bolted, his legs pumping furiously as he ran through the twisting halls of the factory. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body on the edge of collapse, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't think. He just had to get out. The factory seemed to warp around him, the walls shifting, the floor buckling beneath his feet, as if the very building was alive, reshaping itself to trap him. Every turn he took led him deeper into the darkness, further away from any hope of escape. As he rounded a corner, he slammed into someone. His flashlight hit the ground with a crash, the light spilling out in wild, erratic patterns. David stumbled back in horror, recognizing the figure before him. It was him, not the man he was now, but a version of himself from the past. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow, filled with an empty, distant gaze. His clothes were torn, as if he had been here far longer than David had. The man, or whatever this was staring at him with a mixture of fear and resignation. You're still here?" David asked, his voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. It just stared at him, its gaze colder than the darkest night. Suddenly, the man's mouth opened, but the words that came out were not his own. They were the same words the creature had spoken. "The factory never lets you leave." David's blood ran cold. He had seen the future. This was what he was meant to become. He was no longer David Carter, the security guard. He was just another lost soul, swallowed by the factory, a part of its endless cycle. There would be no escape. The factory would consume him, like it had consumed everyone else who dared to enter. "No!" David screamed, as if sheer will could fight against fate. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no fighting this. The factory was its own beast, ancient and unstoppable. As if to answer his scream, the walls around him began to close in, the shadows reaching out like hungry fingers, pulling him in. The cold seeped into his skin, numbing him, and the factory's heartbeat grew louder, its pulse quickening. And then, just like the others before him, David Carter disappeared into the factory, his name lost to the whispers of the building's dark history. The end. Subscribe to my channel's Night Howl.